Thank you for your interest in the update of the housing rules and regulations. I'm Stacy Stoker, the project manager for this project. If you have questions, please contact me at the Jackson-Teton County Affordable Housing Department. My phone number is 732-0867, or you can email me at sstoker@tetonwyo.org. That's SSTOKER@tetonwyo.org. You can also visit the website, which is engage2017.jacksontetonplan.com. The purpose of Engage 2017, Housing, Parking, Natural Resources, includes 5 concurrent projects: updates to the housing mitigation LDRs, updates to the housing rules and regulations, a town parking study and recommendations, and updates to the town zoning. There's also updates to the natural resource LDRs. Today, we're focusing on the housing rules and regulations. You may be asking, what are the housing rules and regulations? The housing rules and regulations help to make sure that the over 800 homes managed by the Housing Department are used in a way that best meets the needs of the community. These guidelines govern who qualifies to live in a Housing Department home and what restrictions apply to living in a Housing Department home. There are currently 5 types of restrictions that are governed by the housing rules and regulations. Affordable units are owner-occupied and restricted to pricing. To qualify, households must meet employment, income, and asset criteria. Employment-based units are owner-occupied and intended to serve households that don't fit within affordable income categories, but still cannot afford to purchase a market-rate home in Teton County. To qualify, households must meet employment criteria and earn 75% of their income from a local business. Workforce housing creates a type of employment-based unit that may be either rental or ownership. The qualification criteria are the same as employment-based, except there is no cap on the initial purchase or rent negotiation. Accessory residential units, or ARUs. These units must be rented to employees working in Teton County. There are no income limits or maximum rents on ARUs. Attainable units were built before housing standards were adopted in the land development regulations. No more attainable units will be constructed, but the rules and regulations still apply through the management of existing units. They have asset limits that are calculated according to their restriction. They do not have a price cap, but buyers must qualify to purchase. There are also income limits based on category. The housing rules and regulations were last updated in 2008. In 2015, the Workforce Housing Action Plan was adopted by the town and county elected officials. It directs staff to standardize and simplify restrictions, to establish minimum restrictions that consistently apply to all subsidized homes, and to develop a single application for all housing programs. Updating the rules and regulations will make sure that these goals are implemented in line with community values and that workforce housing programs are as effective as possible. Here are a few facts about affordable housing. By 2018, the Housing Department will be managing at least 880 ownership and rental units in Teton County. In 2016, 41 ownership units were sold, including 24 new units at the Grove Phase 2. 20 to 30 units sell per year, which includes new construction and resales. In 2016, an average of 44 households applied per house. There are 1,200 households in the Housing Department database interested in finding a home. In 2016, 6 out of 20 rental units turned over. In 2017, 58% of the workforce lived in Teton County. The Housing Rules and Regulations update is part of the Engage 2017 public engagement effort. The Engage 2017 process establishes 4 phases with benchmarks at each phase. The purpose of these benchmarks is to make commitments throughout the process so that by the end only the details are left, with the hope being that this will provide a more efficient process a better product, and a more engaged public. There are 4 phases to this process. The first was to agree to the process. This was done back in February to May of 2017. The next phase was to identify the problems. On June 1st of 2017, an all-day and evening event was held to get public comment to help identify the problems. There was also an event held May 30th in Spanish. An online survey was also available to the public. The public comment and survey was summarized and evaluated by our consultants and staff and presented to the elected officials. In July, the town and county completed phase 2 of the process. With those issues to consider, the Town Council and Board of County Commissioners committed to 12 policy questions. These are the questions that must be answered to update the housing rules and regulations. They are also the only questions that will be answered through the housing rules and regulations update. We will not get distracted by other topics. I will walk through each of these policy questions throughout this presentation. We are now in phase 3 of the public process, which includes this alternatives analysis. The public will have the opportunity to visit with the Housing Department staff, either me or April Norton, during 9 scheduled office hours from September 26th to October 5th. Based on these conversations, an updated FAQ document will be posted. A larger community discussion event will be held on October 2nd in Spanish and on October 9th in English. Time and location will be determined. It is really important for the public to attend the community discussion, not only to provide comment, but also to hear other people's comments and to get a better understanding of the issues. If you can't make the community discussion, an online review survey will be available September 13th through October 11th. All dates and times will be posted online. Please visit engage2017.jacksontetonplan.com to see the schedule. Staff will provide a recommendation considering the public comment on October 12th. The Housing Authority Board will be meeting to make a recommendation on October 18th and 19th. Based on public comment and staff and board recommendations, the Town Council and Board of County Commissioners will meet on October 30th to discuss the alternatives and will release a draft direction on November 3rd. Then, on November 13th, the Council and Commissioners will meet again to provide direction on each of the 12 questions. Staff will then take that direction and draft the housing rules and regulations for review and adoption in the spring of 2018. Now I will begin to walk you through the 12 questions and the alternatives analysis. We'll talk about our current practice or status quo and then discuss alternatives. Policy question number 1. What should the employment criteria be to rent or purchase a restricted home? The status quo is that at least one member of the household is locally employed with inside Teton County a minimum of 30 hours per week or 1,560 hours per year. Or at least one member of the household is a retiree who is at least 59 and a half years old and has worked or volunteered a minimum of 30 hours per week for a local organization the 2 years immediately prior to retirement. Or at least one member of the household is disabled. And at least one member of the household is a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident. This means they hold a green card. Alternative A, keep the status quo. 30 hours per week, or 1,560 hours per year, allows local workforce who may not work year-round but who do work full-time, such as teachers and dual seasonal employees, to qualify for housing. Only one person in the household is required to work 30 hours per week so that the other can care for children, etc. The potential drawback to 30 hours is that it allows people to work less hours and still qualify. For retirees, 59 and a half is the age the IRS allows retirement disbursements without penalty. Anti-discrimination laws allow retirees and disabled individuals to qualify. The potential drawback to 59 and a half is that housing retirees and disabled persons who are not working does not directly further the community's goal of housing the workforce locally. allowing only U.S. citizens or lawful permanent residents to qualify is to ensure that those who purchase and live in government-subsidized homes are paying taxes. The potential drawback to qualifying lawful permanent residents is that if they decide to go back to their home country and stop paying their mortgage, the home will get foreclosed upon. Alternative B. Use the status quo, except require that retirees must be 62 years old. The intent of this would be to limit the pool of qualifying households that do not work a minimum of 30 hours per week. The potential drawback to this is that housing retirees who are not working does not directly further the community's goal of housing the workforce locally. Alternative C. Use the status quo, except one member of the household must work an average of 40 hours per week, with 2 weeks vacation and 10 holidays. The intent of this is to ensure that people living in subsidized housing work year-round, full-time, to maximize the subsidy. The potential drawback is that many businesses in this community operate on a seasonal basis, and their employees would not be able to qualify for subsidized housing. Alternative D is to use both Alternative B and C. Policy question number 2. What kind of assets should be allowed and or counted, and how much is the limit? Allowed assets include gift money, equity in vehicles, RVs, boats, etc., personal items valued greater than $500, bank accounts, investment accounts, trust funds, vested life insurance, commercial properties, residential property, and business assets. Retirement accounts are not included unless money is withdrawn for down payment or other expense. Once the applicant is chosen, improved residential property must be listed for sale, and a sale must occur within 1 year. Total household assets shall not exceed twice the income limit for a 4-person household for the income category. For employment-based units, there is no asset limit. Applicants may not ever own residential real estate within 150 miles of Teton County, Wyoming. As an example of how the asset cap is calculated, the income for a 4-person Category 2 household is $91,400. So the asset cap for Category 2 households is $91,400 times 2, or $182,400. Alternative A. The asset calculation allows a family to hold needed assets, but limits them from holding enough assets to afford a down payment. It is calculated this way so that it is a connection to the income limit, and it is adjusted each year with the income limit. Precluding retirement funds from asset calculation may incentivize households to save for retirement, but it may also allow households to qualify who could otherwise afford a market home if they use their retirement funds for a down payment. The employment-based program that has no asset limit is intended to serve households in higher income levels who still cannot afford a market home. The provision that does not allow them to own residential real estate at purchase or while they own an employment-based unit is to incentivize households to move out and into a market home if and when they can afford to. The potential drawback to the employment-based provision that has no limit on value of assets has the potential of allowing households who could afford a market home to purchase an employment-based home just to save money. Alternative B. Use the status quo, except remove the non-liquid business assets from the asset calculation. The intent of removing the non-liquid business assets is to avoid disqualifying households because their business assets that are essential to running their business exceed the asset limits. The potential drawback to this is that business assets could be a source of funds for a down payment. Alternative C. Use the status quo, except add that mobile homes are included as part of the residential properties. Mobile homes serve as housing and should be considered the same as residential real estate. The potential drawback to this is that mobile homes are taxed as personal property, not real estate. Including mobile homes as residential property may confuse applicants. Alternative D. Use the status quo, except allow households to qualify for affordable units and own residential property anywhere, including Teton County, contingent upon verification that the asset limit is not exceeded. This allows households to have investments as long as they do not go over the asset limit. The drawback is that a household could own an affordable unit and own a market unit in Teton County. Alternative E. Use the status quo, except change the current asset cap of 2 times a 4-person household income for the income category to amount that is based on comparable community asset caps. The potential downfall to this could push the asset limits up to a point that allows people to qualify who could actually afford a market home. Alternative F. Use the status quo, except allow for increases in net asset caps to allow for increases in retirement savings for households with retirees. The drawback to this is that it would allow for retirees who have larger retirement accounts to have more assets and still qualify. Another potential drawback to this is that allowing a higher asset cap for retirees will allow more retirees to qualify, and housing retirees who are not working does not directly further the community's goal of housing the workforce locally. Alternative G. Use some combination of alternatives B, C, D, E, and F. Policy question number 3. How many months out of a calendar year should a household be required to occupy a restricted unit? The status quo for affordable ownership units is 10 months out of the year. The status quo for employment-based units is 10 months out of the year. Affordable rental units is 11 months out of the year, and attainable units are 9 months out of the year. Alternative A, keep the status quo. Requiring households to occupy their homes 9, 10, or 11 months out of each calendar year allows households to take a vacation, but still requires they occupy this restricted unit most of the year. The potential drawback to this is that the housing could potentially sit vacant for 1, 2, or 3 months. Alternative B, standardize all units, all restriction types, 9 months per year. This allows households to have more flexibility on how long they can be away from home. The drawback is that the housing units could sit vacant for as many as 3 months. Alternative C, standardize all units and all restriction types to 10 months per year. This is in line with most existing restrictions. The drawback is that the housing could potentially sit vacant for 2 months per year. Alternative D, standardize all units, all restriction types to 11 months per year. This ensures that the units are occupied and may encourage occupants to find jobs in the shoulder season. The drawback is that it provides households less flexibility for leave or vacation. Policy question number 4. What livability standards, if any, should apply to restricted units? The status quo is that livability standards include minimum and maximum livable area and must include a kitchen, bathroom, living and sleeping areas, and storage. Natural light, landscaping, exterior materials must be compatible with other materials used in the development. Parking must be like other units in the development. Outdoor living space, sound reduction meet building code standards. The minimum required square footage for units for a studio ownership unit is 400 square feet, and for a rental is 350 square feet. For an ownership 1-bedroom, it's 600 square feet, and for a rental unit, it's 550 square feet. For ownership 2-bedroom, it's 850 square feet, and a rental is 750 square feet. Ownership 3-bedroom is 1,200 square feet, and rental is 950 square feet. A 20% reduction in size is allowed if the livable square footage is above grade and each bedroom and living space has an exterior window. Alternative A, keep the status quo. This ensures that units are provided with a base level of components needed for safety, health, and functionality. The minimum size requirement ensures that units are functional and provide space for storage as well. The maximum size requirement ensures that when square footage instead of people housed is required, large units don't take up the entire requirement. The potential drawback is that it potentially increases the price of construction and limits developers' ability to maximize allowed floor area. Alternative B, Use the status quo except require the same minimum square footage for rental and ownership units. Families living in rental units have the same need for storage and space as families who own units. The intent of this is that it simplifies requirements. The drawback is that it may limit the number of restricted units built. Alternative C. Use the status quo except increase or decrease minimum square footage for rental and ownership units. Decreasing size requirements may encourage households to move into the market when they are able. It also may allow for more units to be built. The potential drawback of decreasing size requirements is that it would likely lessen storage space, which is a consistent need in all restricted units. It would also provide less living space for families. Increasing size requirements could potentially provide units with more storage, which is a consistent need in all restricted units. The potential drawback of increasing size requirements is that it would likely increase the price of construction and may decrease the number of units built. Also, households may be less likely to move out of the larger unit into the market. Alternative D. Use the status quo except require all appliances to be ENERGY STAR certified or the equivalent. This would ensure that less energy is used by restricted homes, which achieves comp plan goals and is less expensive for the household. The drawback is that it increases the price of construction. Alternative E. Evaluate how requirements for interior spaces, interior materials, responsible building practices, and quality assurances are different from standard market unit requirements to determine if there is a straightforward way to comply through existing building and design standards that apply to market rate units. This may help to draft livability standards that are equitable across the board. The drawback to this is that market requirements may not be enough to ensure certain standards are met for long-term maintenance, etc. Alternative F. Adopt livability requirements that provide minimums for each feature: unit size, kitchen, including lineal feet of cabinets, closets and storage areas, floor coverings, room sizes and shapes, windows, noise mitigation, laundry, heating and hot water, and finish and fixture specifications. This would ensure that units are provided with all necessary components that will last and are functional to live in. The drawback to this is that it may increase the cost of construction. Alternative G. Use some combination of alternatives B, C, D, E, and F. Policy question number 5. What percentage of a household's income should be spent on housing? The status quo: a household should not spend more than 30% of its gross income toward housing costs. Households may not carry more than 45% of total debt to income, including the mortgage note. Alternative A. Keep the status quo. 30% of income towards housing costs is a HUD standard. HUD considers a family paying more than 30% to be cost burdened. The potential drawback is the lower the percentage of income required to go towards housing costs means a higher subsidy is required for the housing unit. Most mortgage lenders do not allow total debt to income to be more than 45%. For households to obtain financing on restricted homes, banks require that the restriction can lift in case of foreclosure. The home is at risk of being lost from the program if the owner defaults on payment. The housing department requires no more than 45% debt to income ratio to lessen the risk of foreclosure. The drawback to this is that some families cannot qualify to purchase a home because their total debt to income is too high. Alternative B. Use the status quo except include a minimum debt to income ratio. This would avoid housing families in a less expensive home who can afford a more expensive home based solely on income and assets. The drawback is that if a family qualifies in Category 1 based on income, but their debt to income is below the minimum, they would not qualify for affordable housing and likely would not be able to afford a market home. Alternative C. Use the status quo except remove debt to income ratio limit entirely. The intent of this is that more families would be able to qualify for housing. The drawback is that it would increase the risk of losing units to foreclosure. Alternative D, use the status quo, except increase the percentage of gross income a household may use towards housing costs. The intent is that it lessens the subsidy in the home and allows fewer households to qualify because the price of the home would be higher. The drawback is that it increases the risk of losing units to foreclosure. Alternative E, use some combination of alternatives B, C, and D. Policy question number 6. When should a household have to qualify for a rental or ownership home? The status quo for affordable ownership units is that a household only has to qualify at the time of purchase. Requalification is not required. For ARUs, employee housing units, and employment-based units, annual requalification is required. Alternative A, keep the status quo. For affordable units, this allows households to earn more money so that they can eventually move into the market. A drawback is that without regular requalification for affordable units, there is no way to ensure that these units are being used to house local workforce households earning less than 120% of area median income. For employment-based units, ARUs, and employee housing units, the Housing Department has authority to do annual requalifications to ensure the household still qualifies for the unit. The drawback to this is that annual requalifications of ARUs, employee, and employment-based units takes a large amount of staff time. Alternative B, use the status quo, except standardized requalification requirements for ARU, employee, and employment-based rental and ownership in the rules and regulations, and refer to the rules and regulations in the deed restriction. This would streamline the process for requalification and takes less staff time. The potential drawback is that these new standards will not apply to existing deed restrictions, and this may cause some confusion. Alternative C, use the status quo, except requalify affordable ownership households every 2 years. Use an income threshold that is higher than the original qualification. For example, a Category 2 unit will requalify using Category 4 or 5 criteria. This allows households to increase their income while providing a mechanism for protecting the public subsidy and ensuring units are being used to house qualifying households. The drawback is that it would uproot working families from their home once they hit the threshold, with no guarantee that they would get into another home for which they qualify or be able to purchase a market home. It would also require significant staff time. Alternative D is to use both alternatives B and C. Policy question number 7. How should the sell or rent price be set? The status quo for sales prices is that we assume that 30% of a household's income is going towards housing costs, 25% towards mortgage, and 5% towards HOA dues, taxes, and insurance. We assume a 30-year mortgage at 7.5% interest rate with 5% down payment. Income used is 10% less than the maximum for the category and household size based on one person per bedroom. This means that if we have a 2-bedroom unit, then we would assume 2 people would be in that unit, so we would use the 2-person household income to calculate the price. The maximum rent price calculation for Housing Authority-owned rentals uses 70% of area median income, 30% of a household's income toward housing costs and utilities. Qualified households earning 100 to 120% of median income will pay an additional $50 per month in rent. Household size based on 1 person per bedroom, and for employee housing units, the maximum rent cannot exceed fair market rent calculated annually by HUD. Alternative A, keep the status quo. The intent of the status quo is to price homes so that they are affordable to the mid-range of the category, allowing more than just the top income earners in the category to afford the unit. Housing Authority rents for Phase 1 of the Grove were assumed at the lowest category for Grove Phase 1 budgeting purposes. Fair market rents as calculated by HUD are based on actual market rents in Teton County. There are some potential drawbacks to the status quo. Interest rates are currently lower than 7.5%, So households should be able to afford higher priced homes. Households may have a larger down payment than 5%, which would allow them to afford a higher priced home. Households in the lower end of the income range will have a more difficult time affording restricted home prices. Fair market rents have a 3 to 5 year lag time and do not always accurately represent the current market. Alternative B. Use the status quo, except for employee housing units. Calculate maximum rents based on 30% of the household income at the low end of each category. For example, if a two-person household earns an income of $55,000, they fit into Category 1. The low end of Category 1 is 70% of median, or $51,184. 30% of $51,184 is a monthly rent of $1,280. The intent of this is that households in Category 1, 2, and 3 will be paying rent that is affordable to their income levels. The drawback is that some households will pay less than what is affordable for them because the low end of the income range is being used to set the rent rate. Alternative C. Use the status quo, except allow for multi-unit developments to have an additional increase in initial sales price if certain criteria are met. This would likely encourage multifamily development designs that exceed livability minimums. Drawbacks are that this may exclude some households from purchasing a restricted home because homes will cost more and may decrease the number of units built if larger, more expensive units are being built. Alternative D. Use the status quo, except base the mortgage interest rate on the 20-year average and recalculate each year. The intent of this is that the mortgage interest rate used will be the actual current 20-year average and may allow more households to qualify for restricted housing. Interest rates could fluctuate lower or higher than the 20-year average, which could result in households qualifying for a home that's too expensive and increase the risk of losing units to foreclosure. Alternative E. Use the status quo, except when calculating the sales price, use 8% instead of 5% towards HOA dues, taxes, and insurance, and use 22% toward mortgage. HOA dues, taxes, and insurance may cost more than 5%, which could make the unit unaffordable to the homeowner and increase the risk of losing units to foreclosure. Maximum sales prices will be lower, causing subsidies to be higher. Alternative F. Use the status quo, except for housing authority-owned rentals, use the mid-range for each income category. The intent of this is to charge what is affordable to each category and decrease the subsidy to Category 2 and 3 households. The drawback of doing this is that it will likely increase rent rates for current tenants. Alternative G. Use some combination of alternatives B, C, D, E, and F. Policy question number 8. How should restricted ownership homes be valued at resale? The status quo is that the original purchase price is used and added to it is 2.5% annual appreciation, plus the cost of required capital improvements, plus the cost of capital improvements not to exceed 10% of the original purchase price, only with prior approval from the housing department, and minus maintenance adjustments required by the housing department at the time of sale. For example, if a home's original purchase price is $300,000 and after 10 years the homeowner decides to sell it, it would have appreciated by $93,626. If they added $16,000 in capital improvements, we would add that to the $93,626. If their maintenance costs at the time of sale is $9,000, say they had to replace the carpeting and repaint, then we would subtract that. Now we end up with a maximum resale value of $409,626. Alternative A, keep the status quo. In 2005, 2.5% was the average amount of incomes increased in a 10-year period. This figure was intended for homes to appreciate at the rate that incomes appreciate to keep them affordable. The drawback is that if incomes do not increase 2.5% each year, then units may appreciate at a rate that makes them unaffordable to the category. Alternative B. Use the status quo and include a depreciation factor within the calculation of the resale value. Appraisers deduct value for the age of the home. It makes sense to depreciate homes as they age and require more maintenance. The drawback is that owners will not be able to gain as much equity in their homes, and this is often what allows them to move into the market. Alternative C. Use the status quo, except base the annual appreciation on the Consumer Price Index, capped at 3%, determined annually. The Consumer Price Index measures changes in the price level of consumer goods and services purchased by households. This method was used in the early years of the program. It bases appreciation on inflation rather than incomes. The drawback is that homes may go down in value some years if CPI is negative. Alternative E. Use the status quo, except base the annual appreciation on the actual wage increase for Teton County each year, using median family incomes as calculated by HUD, capped at 3% annually. For example, in 2015, incomes decreased 1.07%. Then, in 2016, they decreased again 1.06%. And then in 2017, they increased by 6.5%. This would be a more accurate way to ensure homes remain affordable, but homes could go down in value if incomes go down. Alternative F. Use some combination of alternatives B, C, D, and E. Policy question number 9. How should rental or subletting be handled? The status quo in all ownership units is that rental is only allowed for special and temporary circumstances, such as leaving to care for a family member, and it must be pre-approved by the housing department. In rental units, subleasing is never allowed. Alternative A. Keep with the status quo. Restricted units were not meant for people to use as investment properties, but things happen in people's lives that require them to be gone for periods of time. Sometimes there's not time to make a special request to the housing department. Alternative B. Use the status quo except allow for the rental of units that are in the active process of being sold by the owner, particularly in situations where the homeowner has an urgent need to move. This gives the homeowners flexibility during the process of selling their home and ensures the unit is still being occupied by a member of the workforce, but having a tenant in the unit during the sales process can complicate the process. Alternative C. Use the status quo, except allow owners to rent rooms to individuals who are employed in Teton County as long as the total household income does not exceed the income limit for the category of the home, and the number of individuals living in the home does not exceed town or county occupancy requirements, and the owner of the home still occupies the unit. This would allow us to potentially house more of the workforce, but it also increases the potential for abuse, particularly as it relates to rent charged by the homeowner, and more staff time is required to qualify renters and ensure compliance. Alternative D. Use both alternatives B and C. Policy question number 10. How should the buy-sell process work? The status quo in all affordable and employment-based units is that unless otherwise stated in the deed restriction, a lottery process is used to determine who may purchase the unit. The housing department receives a 2% facilitation fee for each transaction that covers the cost of advertising, staff time, and costs of sending the lottery to an outside counsel for drawing it. First priority is given to qualified households who live within the same neighborhood or development as the house for sale. All lotteries are sent to outside counsel to be drawn. Each household is placed in the order drawn so that the home can be offered to the next household in line if needed. Status quo for affordable units is that preferences are given for households who meet the following criteria: 4 years of full-time employment by a local business immediately prior to entering the lottery, or critical services provider. Once a household has entered a lottery 3 times and been in the top preference category, The household will begin receiving an extra entry in each subsequent affordable lottery. Status quo for employment-based units is that the lottery is based on a point system that gives 1 point for each year of full-time employment immediately prior to the lottery up to 5 years, and 1 point each for up to 2 critical service providers per household. Alternative A, keep with the status quo. This provides an objective, equitable process for determining who may purchase or rent the unit. As families grow, they can move into larger units, opening up smaller ones, and stay in the same neighborhood. Having outside counsel draw the lottery makes the process more transparent. Preferences or points are given to people who have staying power in our community and who are needed for health, safety, and welfare reasons, the critical service providers. And extra entries are given to help households who continue to not be selected and allow them to have a better chance. But there are drawbacks to keeping the status quo. The lottery process is complicated and hard for some people to understand. And giving families already living in neighborhoods preference has been frustrating to other households trying to get a restricted home. Outside counsel can be expensive and slow and does not guarantee a transparent process. Giving preference increases the subjectivity of the process. And by not requiring a full application at the time of lottery entry, some households may apply for units for which they do not qualify and receive extra lottery entries as a result, unless they're chosen, in which case they will lose all of their lottery entries. Alternative B, use the status quo and give preference to households who are renting restricted units. This would allow households in rental units to move into ownership easier. The rental unit would then open up to another household, but this could also cause problems with rental leases and terms. Alternative C, use the status quo and give preference for retirees who can verify employment for 10 years or more in Teton County immediately prior to retiring. This rewards the investment people have given to the community, but it could be difficult to verify 10 years of employment. And housing retirees who are not working does not directly further the community's goal of housing the workforce locally. Alternative D, use the status quo and give top preference for households that have repeatedly submitted for the lottery unsuccessfully for a minimum period of time. This could alleviate the frustration of households who have repeatedly unsuccessfully applied for homes and lotteries. But it could have the unintended consequence of households beginning to apply for everything to get top preference, regardless of whether or not they can qualify for the home. Alternative E, use the status quo, except remove preference for qualifying households to purchase homes that are located within the neighborhood that they currently reside. This would make lotteries equitable across the board, but could force families already living in neighborhoods that have grown out of their home to have to try to find a restricted home in another neighborhood. Alternative F, use the status quo, except draw the lottery in a public meeting. This may remove some of the mystery or skepticism from the lottery process, but it may also slow down the process and not address concerns over lack of transparency in the process. Alternative G, use the status quo, except use a point system lottery for all ownership units. The point system gives critical services providers who have worked in Teton County for at least 5 years priority for a home, which will decrease the chances of receiving a home for a large portion of qualifying households that either do not have time to volunteer as a CSP or that are not employed as a CSP. Alternative H, use the status quo, except remove preference for critical service providers. This would give all workers in Teton County equal weight in the lottery. However, the community needs critical service providers living locally for quick response to health and safety emergencies, and this would lower their chances of being chosen in the lottery. Alternative I, use the status quo and include preference for town and county employees. This would increase the odds of a town and county employee being chosen to purchase or rent a home, but it is a less equitable process. Alternative J, use the status quo and require households to pay fees for entering a lottery, annual requalification, and for capital improvement requests. This discourages households from entering lotteries for units that they do not want or do not qualify for just to get extra entries in future lotteries. It also helps to pay for a portion of the staff time spent on lotteries, requalifications, and capital improvement requests. The drawback is that depending on the amount of the fee, this could become burdensome for households seeking restricted housing. Alternative K. Use some combination of alternatives B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and I. Policy question number 11. What types of relief should be allowed from the rules and regulations? The status quo is that we allow people to apply for exceptions for unique situations related to the purchase or rental of a home, appeals from decisions of the housing manager, and grievances for harm done by the established rules and regulations. Alternative A, keep with the status quo. All situations are unique, and the rules and regulations cannot speculate every one. This allows the housing department to review special circumstances to determine if the rules can be flexible. The drawback is subjective decisions may cause confusion for neighbors or community members who assume non-compliance. Alternative B, use the status quo and formalize the appeal process, including the appeal hearing, and model it after the Wyoming contested case rules. This would clarify the process for all involved in an appeal or a hearing, but may lengthen the appeal process, requiring more staff time and costing more for the appellant. Alternative C, use the status quo and set out standards for making determinations on exceptions, appeals, and grievances. This would provide more guidance to the housing manager and the Housing Authority Board in making decisions, and more clarity for the public. But standards could be too narrow and cause unique situations to be left out. Alternative D, use alternatives B and C. Policy question number 12. How should new rules and regulations be applied to existing units? The status quo is that special restrictions supersede the rules and regulations. If provisions are not specifically outlined in the special restrictions for a unit, the restrictions default to the currently adopted rules and regulations. Alternative A, keep the status quo. Old restrictions were more likely to specifically outline items now addressed in the rules and regulations. This gives homeowners more certainty as it relates to occupancy and use of their unit. However, until all special restrictions are standardized, there will be inconsistency between how issues with different units are handled. Alternative B, use the status quo and specify that the rules and regulations adopted at the time of resale will govern the sale of a restricted unit unless otherwise stated in a special restriction. This allows changes to be made to the rules and regulations without having to change the restriction. A 45-day public review and comment period is required anytime a change is made to the rules and regulations. Doing this could cause owners to get confused when rules and regulations change. Alternative C, use the status quo and new restrictions will be recorded at resale unless the standard restriction is already in place. The standard restriction will refer to the rules and regulations where appropriate. This allows for changes to the rules and regulations without having to change the restriction, and over time decreases staff time needed, but some staff time will still be needed initially. Alternative D, use the status quo and for rental units establish that the rules and regulations in effect at the time the rental agreement is entered will apply. This will clarify which rules and regulations apply to tenants in their rental unit, but tenants may get confused about which rules and regulations apply to them. Alternative E, use some combination of alternatives B, C, and D. This concludes the Housing Rules and Regulations Update Alternatives Analysis. Thank you for participating.